Alright, let's get into lighting here. And this is our scene laid out. And so in our design, our lighting design sketch, we wanted that light to come in from screen left. We know it was going to be a low light, early morning. So that key light is going to be going to have a little bit of warmth to it. And then all of this is going to be lit with the skylight. So knowing that, we have to do several things. You can see the lights here. So what I do first is create the key light. This is our key light here. It's a V-Ray area light, and or also called a plane light in Max. I'm gonna set the color to something really warm. You know, you get those warm pinky oranges in the morning as the sun's starting to come up, and it gets hit on, you know, really high mountains or points. So that's what we want to do. Create a nice warmth in here. And what I click on is no decay. Because this is the sun, it's not gonna fade out. It's gonna be consistently, the rays are gonna shoot out consistent from the light source. So I hit no decay. And we can increase the sampling here if we want to. For our reasons, we're going to keep it to 8. But if you were to render and you see a little bit of noise, especially in your shadow areas, it might be because of the sampling. It might be in the key light, but for the most part, our dome light's going to be controlling the fill light, and that's where we'll increase the sampling. So nothing to it here. And what I'm doing is I'm placing it, and there's going to be a lot of trial and error too, placing your light in the direction, the angle, the tilt, and getting it just right to hit the scene exactly what you need. So a lot of trial and error. But what I do is, if you have a softer light, not casting really hard shadows, you want to make your light source really big and quite a bit away from your scene. The smaller the light source, if I scale this down, the tighter and crisper the shadows are going to be. So pay attention to that too. It depends on what kind of lighting that you're going for. We want that nice kind of the sun just coming up, hitting the top, soft shadows, nothing too harsh, and that's what's going to give us our nice, beautiful lighting. So that's our key. And again, the height and the tilt of all this and its position is going to determine how that light affects your scene. So you move it around until you get it where you want it to be. So the next big thing is we have our key light, and that's our sun. We also want to set up our fill light, which is our sky. And when setting that up, it's basically a V-Ray dome light. And the intensity is controlled here by the multiplier, but the color is going to be driven by the HDR map right here. So if you're unfamiliar with HDR maps, I'll show you what they are. They're generally, you can do HDRs of anything, but in our case we want HDR for the sky. And HDR stands for high dynamic range image. And basically, if you understand photography, and we talked about exposure, what it does is it sets the exposure, a certain amount of exposure. So let's say we set up our camera to shoot 10 different stops, it's called in photography, or exposures. It'll go from the brightest bright and the darkest dark, and then what it does is it combines all of these and stores all of that information into one image. And what that does is it allows us, these are 32-bit HDR images. And if you ever played with Nuke, if you took it into compositing package, you can really push and pull the grade from darkening it down to almost black and there'll still be information, and cranking it up all the way to white and there'll still be information in the brightest brights. And that's because we shot multiple, like in the example, 10 different exposures, so it captures information along all those exposures and combines it into one. So when we push and pull it, it basically has that information stored in from a different exposure. So that's basically HDR maps in a nutshell. Of course, there's more technical aspects to it that we won't get into. But generally, I like to go to CG Source is a great website for HDR plates. And I generally look for the same kind of lighting that I'm going for. Now, in our case, we have a key light. And what this will do, if you used an image like this, and this is great because it shows you how it affects different materials in the scene, and we can rotate the map to see how it's going to affect our geometry. And as you notice, there is a sun in here. And HDR maps, when you load it up in here, in Max, it's going to use that sun as a key light, essentially, and as the main source of light. So as you rotate it, you're going to see the key light hitting our object here and the fill coming in from the rest. But since we're setting up a key light ourselves and we're designing the light to our sketch that we painted earlier on, this isn't going to help us too much because the sun is where it is and you can't move it and design it to meet to match our concept painting. So unless you actually painted this exact same lighting design and you're fine with it, then you can use it straight up. But in our case, whoops, sorry about that. In our case, we have designed light. So if we go back, we have our key light set up. We want something that's cloudy because it's still morning, it's still dark. We can use a cloudy image, or if it's a brighter sky, we want that fill to really brighten up that shadowed area, which is what I want. I may go for a cloudy sun lighting condition here. And I'm not sure which one I chose for this. But let's see, if we took a look at just a random one here, we still have a little bit of a key light, which we don't want. So we may want to go for something like this, where it's cloudy enough that there is no key. We see a little bit of color, but that's okay because our color scheme is very close to this anyway. So something like this, and we can grade it in a compositing package because Photoshop actually doesn't. It does. You can pull in HDRs, but the color profiles might be a little messed up for you. So I would pull it into either After Effects or Nuke compositing and push and pull it to what you need. But this is a good start for what we want. So we load that up. And you want to set it up as a V-Ray HDR map. And if we created a standard material here, and we went to V-Ray material, right here in the diffuse is where you would plug in your map. Let me just check one thing here. Let me see if I can jump. Okay, no. We'll load it in the diffuse. And when you click that diffuse, you're going to see a few more options here. And we want the V-Ray HDRI. So we load that up. Now we don't need to load that diffuse, and the only reason I did that is because I can drag this to, map and load it into my material editor here. And this is where now I can drag this material into my dome light. So I can say copy it over and you'll see it switch. Now there's nothing loaded in here, so we can load our own and throw it in here, We'll replace it. Bam, we're in. So let's take a look at this. We want to set the mapping type, and this is where you load your file. You can see it going from the tutorial scene. The mapping type, we want it to be spherical. So what it's basically doing is mapping a sphere around your entire scene. We want it to surround our entire scene like a sky would. This horizontal rotation is going to change the horizontal rotation of your image. So if you want to move that light around, you want to get a different look, you can shift it along the horizontal, not the vertical. You don't want to touch the vertical, just the horizontal. So you'd be spinning that sphere around until you get what you want, and that's all there is to it. You copy it over in here, and that's where it's stored. Now in this breakdown here, we want to also click no decay. Because the sky is illuminated and it doesn't really have a fall off, we want to hit that too. You want to click invisible here, or else the sky will show up in the background. We don't want it to show up, and we can increase subdivs to get less noise in the shadows, which I won't do because it increases your render times. So we disregard the color because the color is driven by the HDR map, and your multiplier can be set to how much you want that fill light to be affecting your scene. And that's the dome light there, and that drives our fill light. So we have our key, our fill, and one more thing that I like to do usually is whenever you have lower light, we have a low key light and it's just hitting, you know, the top most surfaces and everything else kind of falls into shadow. What I like to do is add a big area light here, same kind, it's a plane, but it's on a very low multiplier, 0.2, and I like to have it the color of the sky. Now I like to saturate a little bit more to exaggerate that lighting, but you can desaturate that to whatever you like. We also want to hit no decay, and you can see the subdivs here are really high because it's in the shadow areas. We can lower this for now to 8 to save on render times. And what this is going to do, a top light generally adds form to your scene. So whenever you have a lot of shadows, sometimes it could use a little bit more breakup. So that top light is going to hit all the top surfaces and separate it so we get that 1-2 read. We never want values to start merging into one. If you blurred your vision or you squint at your scene and you can see kind of all the values mushing together, we start to lose the form. So what that top light does is it hits the top facing surfaces and creates that 1-2 read. And I'll show you in a minute. I have a render in Photoshop here that we could take a look at. And that's just a big light pointing straight down, and there's no decay, so all the rays go straight down, and it just picks up and cuts out a little bit of that form. So once we're all set up with that, let's take a look at, I've rendered something out, and you can see the noise in here too. That's from the low sampling, just to get a fast render. And I've rendered it out so you guys don't have to wait and see the buckets rendering. My machine isn't the fastest in the world, so. Alright, so what we have here, what we see is the key light affecting there. All of this area is driven by that dome light that we had with the HDRI mapped in. And then you also see this top light. We get that lighter, and then we get that 2 read. So we have the 1-2 read, lighter, and this is nice because it causes that form. When you have a top light coming down, especially on spheres, it's really nice because it lights it, and then it kind of has that gradient fall off that really adds form and readability to your shapes. And that's what we want. We want to be able to read the forms and the shapes. Alright, so some of the things that we ended up doing is just catching just a little bit of that side light there from our key. And what we're doing is, and we took a look at this with the lighting design talk that we had earlier, was cutting out shapes from the background. So you could see that even though we studied characters and in film, the lighting, we can apply some of the same principles to our own scene. So I have the key light cutting this guy out So we have a light against dark. And when we put the fog in, there's no fog or atmosphere in this yet because this is just the lighting stage. We're really going to see that being cut out because not only do we have the dark against light to help us cut the form and the shapes out, but we're going to have a difference in contrast, meaning as that fog gets heavier and goes further back, we took a look at the diminishing of contrast as it goes further into the Z and into the environment. We're going to have the contrast and the details get less and less. The contrast and the values between the lights and darks get less and less. So that will allow this shape to be cut out. Right now, because there is no fog, I have this cutting out on the dome, but this kind of, if you squint your vision, it starts getting really mushy with something behind it. We're starting to lose those edges, and we're going to bring it back with the fog. So not to worry about that. So we have right here dark against the lighter sky. We have light against the darker sky, most likely. Again, cutting this out from the sky. That light against that dark. And starts going everywhere here. Light against dark here. We'll start to play around the light against dark. Really cutting out those shapes against each other. Against each other. Against each other. And really starting to bring forms in front and behind others through this. And later on we're going to add some lights as well in the street light to add a little more visual interest and cut some of these shapes out as well. But for now we're just looking at key light and the fill light. So you can see some of the same principles coming through, and not only are we going to use lighting to cut out our shapes, but we're going to use atmosphere, we're going to use Z depth and contrast, values, color to push this scene into real depth, create that mood through atmosphere, and really get this thing moody and believable. All right, so let's jump back into our scene here. So these are typically the three lights that I like to set up with. You might not always need the top light, but I always put it in and compare it without and see if it's adding anything or is it, adding too much. But you could always just hit that on button and it's off. There's no harm. Our key light, again, warm. The multiplier you can play with. And the subdivs here controls the sampling, as you saw in the noise. Not much to that. And then our dome light finally is driving the fill light. Loading the HDR map, as we saw, downloaded from a nice source here. Brought in, set the multiplier, the color is disregarded, and we can turn up our sampling here to get rid of the shadows. Alright, so that is all there is to lighting. Again, it takes a lot of trial and error. Move your light, press render, and do small renders, low sampling. We don't care about the noise or making a pretty rendering at this point. We just want to see where light is getting hit. And the faster your renders, the faster you're gonna hit your visual target. Move it around, up or down, left or right, tilt it to get the exact same, to get the same design that you painted in your scene. There it is. Let's jump into setting up render layers.